Hello, and welcome back to some more biology fun. Today we are going to continue with our biology unit. And yeah, let's see how far we can get as we move forward. Let's get into it. So last time we finished up talking about our basically the ability to classify different types of species and different types of life, what it means to be alive, and all of the different ways of classifying different forms of life. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the types of molecules that go into forming life. Okay, so there are many different types of molecules that are very important to life, and I want to go through each one of them individually. And talk about what they are and what they mean and kind of the function that they serve. Okay? So the first I want to talk about are called lipids. Lipids. Lipids are essentially energy reservoirs. Okay? You could also call them fat. This is what fat is. It's essentially the body or the organism storing energy that has been consumed for later use. Okay? Lipids also serve as a waterproof barrier. Oops. Okay? And because of this waterproof effect, they make excellent cell membranes. Okay, so individual cells, they have an outer skin or membrane that is composed or made up of lipids. Okay, and this is directly due to the fact that the lipid serves as a waterproof barrier, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. Okay, so those are lipids. The next molecule that's quite important, or the next class of molecule that's quite important, are known as proteins. Okay. Proteins are extremely diverse. There are many trillions of different types of protein, and each of them serve a different function. Okay. These are functional molecules that are created by the cell. Okay, so they're created by the cell, they're created by the living organism, and they serve some function within that organism. They can serve both a structural function and a chemical function. So structural meaning it helps the cell or whatever type of organism or tissue retain its shape or grow in a specific way. And chemical means that it helps some sort of chemistry happen within the cell that's very useful, for example, the production or the consumption of energy. Now, another thing that's really important about proteins is that their shape determines their function. Okay, so you can imagine you can put a molecule together in many different ways. The shape of these protein molecules determines what type of function they carry out. Okay. The next bit of molecules that are important for life are nucleic acids. Okay, nucleic acids, I'm sure you've heard of them, DNA, RNA. These are built from units called nucleotides. Okay, so They're built from units of nucleotides. For example, DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid stores heritable information. Okay, so it encodes heritable information in much the same way that your computer encodes, for example, when you save a picture of a cat wearing a happy birthday hat, you know, those conical hats. I'm sure that you guys have all saved pictures of your cats wearing their happy birthday hat, right? Of course you have. Everybody has, right? When you save that image on your computer, what your computer is doing is converting that image into digital data somehow. So it's saving it as bits, where the bits are either a 1 or a 0. All right. DNA does much the same thing. It stores heritable information by having different forms of nucleotides in different combinations within the DNA strand itself. Okay. So it's just like a computer, except it works in a more biological fashion. Okay, the DNA not only stores heritable information, but it also dictates the function of all cells. Okay, all of the cells, for example, within a human body, within your body, have the exact same DNA. Every single one has the exact same DNA in it. Okay? And it's a copy. Every single one is a copy of the initial DNA that was made when the sperm and the egg came together to form you. This DNA must therefore dictate the form and function of all of the cells that make up your entire body. And the cells themselves must be able to read the specific part of the DNA that is important to their function. Okay, so not only does the DNA store heritable information, but it dictates the function of all the cells. So how your body works is completely dictated by this massive molecule that is in every single cell in your body. And as if that's not enough, the DNA strand also encodes for proteins. Okay, so it encodes all of the different proteins that that particular cell needs, and it tells the cell through coded information how to produce those proteins. Okay, so that's nucleic acids, and the class that we will be concerned with in this course is just DNA. There are other types of nucleic acids, and if you guys are interested, you're more than welcome to look that up. But for now, we're just going to deal with DNA. Okay? Okay, the next class of molecules that are important for life are carbohydrates. Got to get your carbs, right? Got to get your carbs. Carbohydrates are sugars. Whoa, that's a really bad sugar. Sugars, starches, and cellulose also is included. Okay, and carbohydrates are used as energy storage. Okay, plants use carbohydrates, sugars, and starches to store their energy that they produce by absorbing the sunlight and taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay, they take that carbon dioxide and they use the energy of the sun to build sugars. So whenever you're eating a vegetable, you are consuming a solar farm. Isn't that interesting? You're consuming a solar farm. Each plant in and of itself is its own solar farm. It's absorbing the energy from the sun and converting that energy into chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates, sugars, starches, and also cellulose. Okay, But cellulose is not necessarily an energy storage system. It's more structural. Okay, so energy storage is sugar and starch. And structural type things are cellulose. This is what people are talking about when they talk about the fiber. Oh my goodness, I can't write cellulose. Oh, oh gosh. Okay, I need to focus. Cellulose. There we go. We did it. We did it. Good job, guys. Okay, yeah, cellulose is what people are talking about when they talk about fiber that you get from plants. So there's dietary fiber that you can consume from plants, and this helps your body in different ways. Well, the plant itself is simply using that cellulose to create its structure. So with a tree, for example, it allows the tree to grow up tall and straight and towards the sun. Actually, all plants it allows to do that. It forms the stem. It helps it keeps its shape. Okay, and that's what cellulose is used for in a plant. Okay. Now, all of these molecules of life, all of the ones that we've just talked about, starting with lipids and going through proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates, all the way down, all of them are primarily composed of four elements. Okay, so even though we have 118, 125 known elements within our universe, life only requires 4 elements, okay? And actually only 3 of them in high quantity. Okay? So I'm actually going to change that to 3. Carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay. We can also throw hydrogen in there too. I think hydrogen is also important enough, but sometimes it's not really included. I'll change it back to 4. Okay, so molecules of life are primarily composed of these carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And that makes up basically all of the different types of molecules that we just talked about. Okay, which is pretty amazing. All of that diversity is made of only these 4 elements, and only these 4 elements are necessary for life, which is pretty incredible to think about. Now, of course, there are other elements. There, for example, sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, sulfur, etc. All of these things are also extremely important. Iron, extremely important to the human body and the way that it functions, or life in general and the way that it functions. But these 4 are the most important. Okay. So next, those are all of the molecules that make up life. Next, I want to move up the chain, or up the degree of structure that we talked about at the very beginning, the degrees of life, moving up from molecules into the cell. Okay. Okay. What is the cell, and what is its structure? What does it look like? How is it made, etc.? The cell is the smallest unit of life. Okay, it's the smallest unit of life, and in a very general, simple way, it kind of looks like this. Okay, we have one big sac surrounding one tiny sac in the middle. Kind of looks like an egg. The inner sac is called the nucleus. Okay. The outer sac, or the outer shell, is called the plasma membrane. all of the fluid and other stuff that's inside the plasma membrane and outside the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. And this includes things like water, this includes things, proteins, lots of enzymes, tons of stuff is packed inside the cell. It's not just empty space. There is basically zero room within the cell because there's so much moving around. Okay. Now cells are very small. So if we talk about the size of a cell, how big is it across? It's about 5 to 20 microns in diameter. And if you guys remember what a micrometer is, a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Okay, 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So it's 1,000,000 times smaller than a meter. Okay, or 1,000 times smaller than a millimeter. So you can imagine if these are only 5 to 20 microns across, they are quite small. And that's why you can't really see them when you look at your skin with your bare eyes. Even though your skin is made up entirely of cells, you have to use a microscope to see them because they are so tiny. Okay, now let's talk about each one of these parts individually. And I'm going to start with probably, well, what I consider to be the most important part of the cell, because otherwise it would not function as a cell that's separated from its environment. Let's talk a little bit more closely about the plasma membrane. Okay, the plasma membrane is essentially the skin, and I'm going to put quotation marks around that because it's not actually a skin, but it's essentially the skin of the cell. Okay, it keeps all the cell bits in and it keeps all the other stuff out. Okay, so contains and protects. Okay, it keeps all of the good stuff in and all the bad stuff out, and it also helps with homeostasis. Which is this ability for living things to adapt to their environment, to adapt to their changing environment. Okay, so this helps them be able to adapt to any type of changing environment that might happen. Now, if you look, the cell membrane basically surrounds the outside of the cell, and if we take a really close look at this cell membrane here, I'm going to do a zoom in on that one section there, and what it looks like if you look really close are a bunch of lipids that are stuck together where they have a charged group on the outside, okay, and then a fatty group on the inside. And the fatty group I'm drawing as these straight lines because that's kind of what fat molecules look like. Fat and oil molecules look like straight lines usually, something like that. Okay, and so this is arranged in such a way like this, where the outside is basically, here is the outside of the cell, and here is the cytoplasm. Okay, and this structure, which goes all the way around the cell, is called the cytoplasm. Excuse me. No, it's called the lipid bilayer. Bilayer because there's two layers of lipids. There's one lipid layer here, and then there's another lipid layer here. Okay, and these are a particular class of lipids called phospholipids. Okay, and these actually spontaneously form into these spherical balls when they are put in water. So it's a spontaneous process. Okay, and why don't you guys stop and think for a second? Pause the video and stop and think for a second. If you can think of an example of something like a phospholipid, very similar to a phospholipid, naturally forming some sort of spherical boundary when put in water. Okay? Pause the video and think about it for a second. If you came up with the idea of a soap bubble, you are correct. This is the same idea or same principle that's happening behind a soap bubble. Okay, when soap bubbles form, they are essentially spontaneously formed lipid layers that are formed because of the interaction of the inside of the lipid layer. So if you look at a phospholipid, it's composed of a fatty part, okay, which likes to dissolve in oil. And it's composed of a what's called a polar part, or a polar head, which likes to dissolve in water. And as all of you who have cooked know, oil and water do not mix. And so what this thing tends to form spontaneously is all of the charged pieces go towards the H2O because they like to dissolve in water, and all of the non-charged bits are attracted together. So you tend to form this bilayer structure spontaneously, just because you put them into water. Okay? So that's the plasma membrane. Let's talk about the nucleus now. The nucleus is only present in the eukaryotic or the eukarya domain. Okay, so everything in eukarya domain is a nucleic, does have a nucleus, or has a separation of the nucleic acids in the center of the cell. Okay, and the nucleus is basically just a smaller cell that also has a plasma membrane on the outside of it. Okay, and it contains the DNA, or it contains the nucleic acids. Okay, so all of the DNA is present within a nucleus within the cell. It's not just kind of floating around. Okay, and it has some sort of structure in the middle. Okay, and the structure in the middle is what contains all of the DNA, and there are these little pores that are coming in from the outside called nuclear pores. And these nuclear pores transport message molecules to and from the nucleus. So it transports messenger molecules to and from the center of the nucleus. Okay, this center of the nucleus is called the nucleolus. All right, and it's where the nucleic acids are contained. Okay, so essentially the function of the nucleus is that the cell sends a messenger to the nucleus telling it what the cell needs, okay? And then the nucleus sends out encoded information back to the cell in order for the cell to make the bits that are encoded within the DNA itself, okay? And the bits that come out of the nucleus, so the bits that come out are called RNA, which is another type of nucleic acid, and it stands for ribonucleic acid. Okay, so it's like DNA, but it's a little bit smaller than DNA. Okay, so the nucleus sends out encoded bits or encoded messages of RNA back into the cell, and then the cell uses the RNA to produce whatever the cell needs. Usually proteins, but sometimes lipids or carbohydrates. Okay? So the nucleus encodes all of this, and basically the cell senses the need for something, sends information into the nucleus to say, hey, we need this. And the nucleus says, okay, let me check that and send out this RNA that'll help you produce this. So then in a little bit, the nucleus sends out the RNA to produce whatever the cell needs, and then the cell is happy. Okay? And so the cell is constantly checking for things that it needs and producing the things that it needs using this process. Okay, this is all part of the homeostasis. Okay, so that's the nucleus. Let's talk about the cytoplasm. Now, I mentioned already that the cytoplasm is not an empty space. There are tons of things within the cytoplasm. And so let's draw this whole area again. So this is the nucleus right in the middle of the cell. One thing that is in the cytoplasm is what's called the cytoskeleton. Okay. The cytoskeleton is a system of fibers and tubules that keep the cell in its shape. Okay, so in the case of this cell, it would keep it circular, and it would keep the nucleus somewhat in the middle. Okay, now that's just part of it. Okay, so it helps it keep its shape, but also it helps the cell move if the cell needs to move. Okay, so this is a very interesting thing that happens. Say you have a cell, and this cell senses nutrients in this direction. Okay, so it has little nutrient detectors all along the outside of its cell membrane, and it senses that there are nutrients in this direction. Okay, so it sends the signal to the nucleus that, hey, we need to move in this direction. And so the nucleus sends out messenger RNA that encodes the production of fibers within the cell in that particular location. So then what ends up happening is you start to form fibers, and these fibers push out the cell membrane in that spot. Okay, and it continues and continues until it pulls in the nucleus into this new area, and what happens is the whole cell moves over to the new spot. Okay, so it just pulls itself over. It's like a little like a worm. If you've ever seen a worm kind of glide across, you see that it's just kind of slowly moving one bit of it and then sticking that to the ground and then pulling the rest of it forward, and moving one bit and pulling the rest of it. That's exactly how cells move as well. And they use the cytoskeleton to move around. Also, the cytoskeleton helps to anchor the nucleus in the center. I already mentioned this, but I want to write it down. Okay, so it keeps the nucleus in one centralized location, and it also provides a platform or a system of roads, if you want, that proteins and other parts of the cell to move about on, okay? Proteins, other bits of the cell, everything needs to move about in the cell. And these fibers and tubules that are making up the cytoskeleton of the cell basically become like conveyor belts. Okay, they're like conveyor belts. They're moving all these bits. Oops, I spelled that wrong. I think it's an E. They're moving all these bits all over the cell so that they can go to the place that they need to be at. Okay. Okay, the next part of the cell that we need to, or that I want to discuss, or that are within, that are within the cytoplasm. So we're still in the cytoplasm, are something called mitochondria. And you might have seen the meme, I'm sure you have, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, if you ever say that to a biologist, they kind of cringe at you. But I like to think of it as the powerhouse of the cell. I mean, it's essentially a little gasoline plant that's within the cell that's producing all of the things that the cell needs in order to expend energy and produce the things that it needs. Okay, so these little guys here, the squiggles, well, you know what? Let's do these in a different color. That's nice, right? We'll do them in blue, just to make it a little easier to see them. They look like Cheetos, little Cheetos with squiggly guys on the inside. Okay, these are mitochondria. Okay, the mitochondria, they convert oxygen and other compounds like sugars into something called ATP. And this is true in animals, okay? They convert oxygen and other molecules into something called ATP, and ATP is the energy molecule. Anytime any function of the cell needs energy to happen, so anytime the cell needs to do any type of work, they need something called ATP. Okay, they need this energy molecule. And ATP is produced by burning sugars in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so you produce these special molecules called ATP, and then the cell uses ATP for all of its energy needs. Okay, and the ATP is made inside the mitochondria. Okay, it's made inside the mitochondria. Okay, so inside the cytoplasm, there are also these things called vesicles. Okay, you start to see how crammed this inside space of the cytoskeleton, or the cytoplasm actually is. It's not empty space. There's tons of stuff inside of here. Okay, vesicles are small lipid bubbles that contain stuff. Okay, so they're small. Whoa. So they contain things like proteins, and they contain things like enzymes, etc., etc. And they are essentially transport containers. And the reason that they can transport things around the cell is because they have special proteins that are on the outside of the vesicles themselves. So here's the nucleus, here's the cytoskeleton moving all around from the nucleus, keeping that nucleus in place, keeping the cell shape the same. And moving up and down these things are little tiny bubbles, little tiny lipid bubbles, okay? And the reason that they can move up and down is because, and the reason that they can move up and down is because they have special proteins on the outside of them that allow them to move along those structural components. They move along the cytoskeleton, okay? And these essentially just are elevators. That's a good way of thinking about it. And they elevate or move different components that need to go to particular parts of the cell to that particular part of the cell. Okay, so that is a lipid, or that is a vesicle. Okay. So let's take a closer look at the membrane itself. Okay. Okay. A closer look at the membrane. It turns out that the membrane is not smooth at all. Oops, no. It's not smooth. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff sticking out of it. And this, I'm talking about the plasma membrane, the stuff that's on the outside of the cell. Okay? And the outside of the cell is not smooth at all, but it has trillions and trillions of tiny little sensors, molecules, pieces of cell that are sticking out of this membrane that allow the cell to adapt and sense its surroundings. Okay? So on the outside of the cell, there are trillions upon trillions of tiny proteins. Okay, sticking out all over the place that help to feel what's happening on the outside. Okay, they can sense a change in nutrient flow, they can sense a change in temperature, etc., etc. And if you look at them up close, they kind of look pretty funny. They sit right in the middle of the cell membrane, and usually they come all the way through, and they do something like this, and then they come outside, and they have some weird shape, something like this. Okay. Oh, I should have done that in a different color. Well, you get the idea. Okay. This is the protein in here. Okay, that's the protein moving through the cell membrane. And we can draw the rest of the cell membrane on the other side. Okay, so this protein is sticking out into the outside of the cell. And it's also coming through to the inside, to the cytoplasm. And what it can do is it senses some sort of chemical. Okay, so it can sense some chemical, say some chemical shaped like this, comes in and it attaches here on the protein. Now, when this attaches on the outside of the protein, this protein undergoes a chemical change, and it makes it change to look something like this rather than being folded like that. Okay, so when this is folded out like this, it tells the inside of the cell that there is this particular chemical located in this environment on this side of the cell, and it transmits that signal into cell. Okay, so this is how the cell kind of senses its surroundings. It uses what are called transmembrane proteins to sense the surroundings. Okay, that's how it works. Okay, and that signal, after it comes into the plasma membrane. Okay, remember it's all the way out at the very edge, away from the nucleus. The nucleus is what controls everything. But recall that we have these cytoskeleton pieces that are basically stretching all the way from the nucleus up to the plasma membrane. So when this signal comes in, whatever the signal is, it's collected by a vesicle which transports that signal all the way down into the nucleus. Okay? And it tells the nucleus, hey, there's food over here, for example. And the nucleus is like, yum. And it goes that way. Okay? So that's kind of how it works. So the cell, all in all, can respond to stimulus. For example, food. It says, hey, I want that. And the cell moves toward that stimulus. Okay? However, if it's some sort of toxin, then the cell moves away. Okay? It can sense its surroundings, and it can position itself in space so that those surrounding stimuli are either helpful or hindering to the cell. Okay? Now, I am going to post a movie, a YouTube link here, and I recommend you guys watch it. And it's called The Inner Life of a Cell. It is a mind-blowing video that shows you exactly how the inner workings of a cell function using three-dimensionally drawn images. Okay, it is truly incredible to see, and I highly recommend. Check the link below. Okay, so that's one movie. And then there's another movie where a white blood cell, this is a real movie, so the first one is like a cartoon. The second one shows a white blood cell in action, and this white blood cell is sensing and chasing a bacteria, okay, and eventually it eats it. Okay, it eats it. Now the cell doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have ears, it doesn't have any way to sense its surroundings other than these transmembrane proteins, which are picking up on tiny little breadcrumbs or tiny little clues that the bacteria is leaving behind. Okay, so it shows you the ability of a cell to be able to sense its environment and react accordingly towards its function. Okay, so I'll post links to these two movies on YouTube, and you guys should check those out. And that is actually it for the biology section. So I will be getting back with you very soon over an announcement on how we are going to do the exam and what we are going to be doing next in class. Okay, so stay tuned for that, and I hope you guys have a great Tuesday, and I'll see you next time. Take care.